The wind that night never stopped moving. It pressed against the glass like someone trying to see inside, moaning low through the seams of the building, whistling across the empty parking lot. The power flickered once around midnight, just long enough for the lamps in the lobby to buzz and die before returning with that faint electric hum. I was alone at the front desk when the door opened without warning, and the man who stepped inside did not brush the snow from his shoulders or look toward me. He simply paused, dripping on the entry mat, and stared down the empty hallway as if he already knew where he was headed. I don't remember him saying a single word when I asked if he wanted a room. Let me know where you're listening from tonight, and if you've ever found yourself somewhere that felt wrong in ways you couldn't explain. And if these stories keep you company, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. My name is Dana Ellis. I was 37 then, working the front desk at a mountain lodge tucked into a small valley in central Colorado. It was 2006, a winter of record storms that kept the highways closed more often than they were open. The lodge was one of those older places, timber beams darkened with age, stone fireplace, always burning low, and a dozen rooms we tried to keep full through ski season. My co-worker on overnights was Len Turner, the maintenance man, a practical sort who never hurried and never seemed rattled. I'd grown used to the rhythm of those nights, the hiss of the old boiler, the distant thump of pipes shifting in the walls, the occasional gust finding its way through cracks we never could seal. Most nights passed quietly, and I would read or balance receipts while Len made his rounds with his tool belt jingling faintly in the halls. That particular evening had started no differently. Snow had been falling steadily since late afternoon, fine powder carried by strong winds off the ridge. By 9 o'clock, the road leading to town was already covered, and Len mentioned he hadn't seen a single set of headlights in over an hour. We didn't expect any more check-ins. The last couple had arrived just before dusk, their SUV packed high with skis, and they'd gone straight to their room. By midnight, the place felt sealed off from the rest of the world, the storm pressing us in. That was when the door opened, and the man I've come to think of only as the quiet man stepped inside. He looked to be in his early 40s, though it was hard to tell under the heavy coat he wore. No suitcase, no duffel, not even gloves in his hands. He set a stack of bills on the counter without speaking enough for 2 nights and slid the registration card toward himself. His handwriting was cramped, almost unreadable, and he left the line for his address blank. When I asked if he needed help with luggage, he shook his head once clipped and final. I remember glancing at Len, who had come into the lobby just then to check the fireplace, and catching the way his expression tightened. Guests often arrived tired or quiet, but this was different. This was silence that filled the room like a presence. We gave him room 6, second floor, facing the slope. I watched from behind the desk as he climbed the stairs, moving with steady, deliberate steps, not looking left or right. His boots left wet marks on the wood that seemed to linger longer than they should. By the time he disappeared down the hallway, the lobby felt colder. Len muttered something about checking the generator and went out into the storm, leaving me alone with the steady tick of the clock over the desk. An hour passed. I busied myself with the usual paperwork, though I found myself listening for sounds from upstairs, the creak of a floorboard, the closing of a door. Nothing. The register showed his key was taken, Yet the hall remained still. Around 2 in the morning, I decided to bring up extra towels to a guest who had called earlier. When I stepped onto the second-floor landing, the hallway stretched long and silent, lined with doors, painted the same faded green. Halfway down the door to room 6 stood ajar, just slightly, though I knew I had seen him lock it behind him. I hesitated, listening. The wind outside rattled against the old windows, but inside there was only quiet. I tapped lightly on the door frame and called out, asking if everything was all right. No response. I eased the door open further. The room smelled faintly of cold air and pine cleaner, as though no one had been inside at all. The bed was neatly made, untouched. No coat, no boots, no trace of a guest settling in. Only the key resting on the nightstand, though I had handed it to him less than 2 hours earlier. I told myself he must have stepped back out, maybe to smoke, though guests usually asked where. I checked the balcony, sliding the door open against the stiff track. Fresh snow had gathered on the railing, smooth and unbroken. No footprints leading away. I closed the door quickly, feeling the cold settle in my bones. When I returned downstairs, Len was coming in from his rounds, brushing snow from his jacket. I asked if he'd seen our new guest outside. He shook his head. "Not a soul out there," he said. Voice, low, eyes narrowing, as if measuring my tone. I started to tell him about the room, about the key on the nightstand, but something in his look stopped me. He simply said, "Best not to go checking again tonight." And with that, he walked toward the boiler room. The rest of the night stretched long. I found myself glancing at the stairs again and again, waiting for the sound of someone descending, waiting for the quiet man to come back for his key or ask for something ordinary. He never did. By dawn, when the storm finally eased, room 6 remained just as I had found it. Bed untouched, key on the table. No sign that anyone had ever stepped inside. Guests came down for breakfast, stamping snow from their boots, talking about the ski runs opening again. No one mentioned seeing another man. Len and I exchanged a look across the lobby, the kind of glance that carries more than words, and we left the door to room 6 closed. Later that day, when housekeeping finally went in, they reported the same room. Pristine, no trace of occupation, not even wet footprints on the bathroom tile. We never checked him out because on paper he had never really checked in. No ID, no address, just cash, folded neatly in the drawer. Sometimes I wonder if the storm brought him in, only to take him back again. What unsettles me most is how certain I am that I watched him climb the stairs, heavy boots leaving dark prints behind. Yet by morning, even those marks on the wood had disappeared, as though he had never passed that way at all. I don't usually talk about this. It happened during one of those long nights when time feels stretched thin, and the silence inside a building makes every sound seem louder than it should. Back then, I was 42 and working nights as a warehouse supervisor in Allentown, Pennsylvania. The company handled regional distribution for grocery stores, and the work never stopped. Forklifts, humming pallets stacked high with boxes, the air heavy with the smell of cardboard and diesel from the loading dock. Nights were my responsibility. I scheduled the crews, kept the orders moving, and locked up once the trucks were gone. I didn't mind the hours. I was divorced, my kids grown, and there was a strange comfort in the routine. That winter, we brought in new hires to handle the volume, most of them kids barely out of high school. One of them was Wesley Brooks, 19 years old, thin as a rail with shaggy blonde hair that always stuck out from under his cap. He didn't say much, but he worked hard and never complained about the cold or the heavy boxes. I liked him right away, reminded me of myself at that age. He worked the back aisles mostly where the lighting was weaker, and the shelving stretched higher, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. The building had a way of feeling hollow after midnight. Once the early rush of trucks left the crews spread thin through the aisles, and sometimes you could walk the length of the building without seeing another soul. The hum of the refrigeration units was constant, but between cycles, there were lulls so complete you could hear the tick of the exit signs and the soft crack of the concrete settling. It was in those quiet gaps that I sometimes caught myself listening too hard, certain there was movement deeper in the racks. One night in January, Wesley came up to me looking pale, shifting from foot to foot, like he wanted to say something, but wasn't sure how. He asked if there were other workers assigned to his aisle. I told him no, he had the section to himself. He said he'd heard someone pacing on the other side of the shelving, slow and deliberate, following the length of the row, but never crossing into view. I walked it with him, shining my flashlight between pallets stacked with canned goods and paper towels. Nothing but shadows and the smell of dust. I chalked it up to nerves. First month on night shift is always rough. Your body never quite knowing if it should be tired or awake. I told him to grab a coffee and shake it off. He nodded, though I could tell he wasn't convinced. The next night he approached me again. This time his voice carried an edge. He said he'd turned down his aisle to find someone already there, standing perfectly still at the far end. He described a man in dark clothing taller than me, with his hands at his sides. When Wesley called out, the figure didn't move. He only stepped back into the shadows until he disappeared between the racks. We searched the building again, even checked the exterior doors, but everything was locked. Cameras covered the dock and the main aisles, but not the deeper rows where the shelves formed long canyons of steel. I tried to calm him, though I felt unsettled myself. The warehouse had its share of drifters. In the past, people slipping inside during deliveries, but never this late, never with all doors secure. A week later, I found Wesley in the break room staring at the vending machine without touching his coffee. He told me he'd started hearing footsteps behind him, always at the same distance, no matter how fast he walked. He'd stop suddenly, and the steps would stop too, leaving only the faint hum of the freezers. I wanted to believe it was just the echo of his own boots on the concrete, but the way he described it, the pause, the breath of silence, didn't sound like an echo. That night I stayed close to his section, checking in more than usual. Around 2 in the morning, while the others were busy loading an outgoing truck, I walked down his aisle. The air felt different there, cooler somehow, and the fluorescent lights flickered in a rhythm I hadn't noticed before. Halfway down, I stopped. The rows stretched quiet in both directions, boxes stacked high on either side. That was when I heard a soft shuffle behind the shelving. Measured steps keeping pace with mine, separated by a thin wall of corrugated cardboard. I froze, straining to hear. The sound stopped when I did. My flashlight beam slid across the steel uprights, catching only the dull reflection of shrink wrap. I called out my voice, low but steady, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the noise had. I told Wesley later that maybe I'd been mistaken, that maybe it was one of the other guys moving equipment, though I knew exactly where the others were. He didn't press me, but I could see in his eyes that he wanted me to admit more. Things came to a head 2 nights later. It was close to 3 when I realized I hadn't seen Wesley in a while. I walked his section calling his name, but the rows were empty. His pallet jack sat parked against the wall, loaded halfway with boxes he'd been moving. His gloves were on the handle, but no sign of him. I searched every aisle, the bathrooms, even the dock before calling in the police. By the time Officer Brewster arrived, the crew was gathered in the break room, whispering, avoiding each other's eyes. We walked the building together, his flashlight beam cutting sharp lines across the shelving. Nothing. No footprints in the thin layer of dust near the far walls. No signs of forced entry. No missing inventory. Wesley was simply gone. They questioned everyone, checked the security tapes. The cameras showed him entering the building, scanning his badge, clocking in at 10:03 p.m. Then nothing. No exit, no movement through the monitored aisles, no shadow crossing the dock. It was as if he had walked into the rows and dissolved into the shadows. The official word was that he must have slipped out during a truck departure, caught a ride, maybe just quit on the spot. But I never believed that. His coat was still hanging on the rack by the time clock. His wallet and car keys sat in his locker. No 19-year-old kid leaves everything behind like that. For weeks after, I found myself pausing in his aisle, standing perfectly still, listening. Sometimes I could swear I heard breathing, faint and uneven, coming from somewhere higher up in the racks. More than once, I caught movement at the far end, a shape leaning just beyond the reach of the light. Each time I approached, the space was empty. I stayed on at the warehouse another 3 years, long enough for new hires to stop asking about Wesley, long enough for the official story to become rumor. But I never forgot the look on his face that last week, the way his eyes darted toward the end of the aisle, as if he already knew he wouldn't be walking back out. Even now, all these years later, I can close my eyes and hear the steady rhythm of those footsteps on the concrete. Not rushed, not hurried, just measured, patient, and close enough that you couldn't convince yourself you were alone. I grew up thinking the night was quieter than the day, but that isn't true in a city. At night, you just hear different things, and they travel farther because there's nothing ordinary to muffle them. In 2019, I drove a cab on the midnight rotation, mostly around the old loading docks and the forgotten blocks near the river, where the streets turn to cracked concrete and the wind carries a smell of wet steel. People say you get used to that kind of work, but the truth is, you don't get used to it as much as you learn the music of it. Sodium lights humming dispatcher static, when a voice drops out mid-sentence, train horns pushing through the dark like something heavy you can't stop. My shifts started at 10 and ran until dawn. The car was clean, the heater worked if you hit the dash twice, and I kept a paper map folded under the visor out of habit, even though the meter and GPS handled most things. It was late January, the kind of cold that makes the air feel thin. I had just dropped a fare near a shuttered diner on Guinot and was idling at the curb to finish a lukewarm coffee when a man stepped out from the shadow of the doorway. Early 40s, thin face, winter coat zipped to his chin, but not enough to match the cold. He looked both ways without moving his head, much like he was measuring the street instead of checking it. He opened the back door, slid in, and set a folded 20 on the armrest before I could say a word. His hands were bare and too still. "Where to?" I asked, tapping the meter. "Stay on," he said. "I'll tell you as we go." People say that more than you'd think, especially the ones who don't want to be tied to an address. I pulled away from the curb. He leaned forward enough that I could feel the weight of his attention on the back of my neck. "Take 3rd, then turn left at Lydia," he said. "Slow at the corners." We passed a block of brick warehouses with boarded windows and iron doors that looked like they were welded shut in another decade. The streets were empty except for a stray shopping cart rattling in the wind. He had me circle 2 blocks, then cut through a narrow lane behind a freight company whose signs still promised overnight delivery even though the building hadn't been open in years. He was watching the mirrors, not casually, not even suspiciously, more like a man trying to see something he wasn't sure would look back. "Someone meeting you?" I asked. He considered the question as if it had more than one correct answer. "I worked here once," he said finally. "Different company, same buildings. It's not the kind of place you forget your way around." The heater whistled when the car hit 30. He told me to take Independence and stop at a gas station with half its lights burned out. I pulled beside the pump and reached for the meter to pause it, but he put his hand on the back of my seat. "Leave it running," he said. "I won't be long." Inside the glassed-in booth, the overnight clerk watched him walk in. She knew me from other nights and gave me a little wave, then looked past my shoulder toward the street behind us. The passenger stood at the counter without buying anything. He spoke to her for a few seconds, and whatever he said caused her to put both hands flat on the counter and glance at the clock. Then he came back out with nothing in his hands and slid into the back seat like he'd never left. The clerk Marisol came outside in her hoodie and knocked on my window. She leaned down so he couldn't see her face and spoke close to the glass. "You all right tonight?" she asked. "He was here last week. Same time, same way of talking." I said I was fine. She looked at the car, then at me again. "If he asks for the river," she said, "don't take the gravel road. Take the one with the fence. The cops know that one." I thanked her and we pulled away. The man didn't comment on her coming outside. He gave another turn and then another until I realized we were working a slow spiral toward the riverfront, testing each block for something he expected to appear. The clock on the dash read 2:36 a.m., he said. "At the next light, cut your lamps for a second." I hesitated and then did it. In that brief darkness, the street looked like a photograph taken too late, flat and empty. But when the headlights came back on, I noticed a car 2 blocks behind that hadn't been there before. Dark sedan, no plate light. "Friends of yours?" I asked. He didn't answer. He sat back, hands on his knees, and said to take Olive down to the levee road, then right at the sign for Midwest Cold Storage. I knew the place. Everyone did. It shut down after a flood years back, and the only people who went there now were kids who wanted a place to drink or thieves looking for copper. Fencing ran along the property, but the riverside was open where a retaining wall had given way. We turned in where the gate hung crooked, and I killed the lights on my own this time. The building loomed ahead, long and low windows blacked out from the inside. He leaned forward and told me to stop 40 feet shy of the dock. "Leave it running," he said. "If anyone asks, you got turned around and I asked you for directions. Anyone? Who I asked. He looked at the dash clock. You'll know. The car idled with a steady vibration, and I could feel the heat from the vents pulsing against my legs. Wind rolled off the river carrying a damp cold that cut through the door seals and settled on my shoulders. The place had that late-night quiet that makes you aware of small sounds you'd miss in daylight. Something loose on the roof clattered lightly. The building creaked in a slow, tired way, the way old structures breathe when the temperature drops. At 2:43, he checked the door handle as if to remind himself how it worked. I'm going to the dock, he said. If the other car pulls in, don't flash your lights, don't honk, just sit. This will only take a minute. You want me to call someone if they show I asked? He considered, then shook his head. No, he said, not yet. He opened the door slowly and stepped out, closing it with his hand so it didn't slam. He moved toward the loading dock with a kind of careful certainty that made me think he had walked the same route 100 times. I lost him when he reached the shadow under the overhang. Seconds later, there was a soft thud, like something being set down gently instead of dropped. Then another. A third, followed by the scrape of wood against concrete and the steady sound of someone counting under their breath, carried back to the car in little pieces, as if the wind had been asked to keep a secret and didn't know how. At 2:47, exactly a white light flickered once in a window near the far corner, not bright enough to be a flashlight, not the cold blue of a phone, just a brief bloom like a camera strobe on its last surge of battery. The sedan from earlier turned in at the gate and rolled slowly across the lot, stopping sideways behind me, as if to block me without quite doing it. No headlights. The driver's window was down, but I couldn't see a face, just the darker shape of a head and the faint smell of cigarette smoke carrying on the wind. Nobody spoke. They waited, and I understood that whatever would happen wasn't going to happen to me unless I insisted on making it mine. The light in the window flickered again. The sedan eased forward and then stopped. Somewhere behind the dock, metal clinked against metal, followed by a muffled voice I couldn't place. I felt every second of the next minute as if time had decided to stretch rather than pass. Then, as neatly as you could ask, 2 police cruisers swung through the far entrance with their low beams on no sirens, just the quick, controlled movement of people who already knew the layout. The sedan snapped on its headlights and reversed, backing toward the gate so smoothly the tires didn't even chirp. By the time one cruiser angled behind me, the sedan was gone. Officer Sutton stepped out with his hands visible, and his voice low, the way officers talk when they want your nerves to stay in their lane. He asked for my license and told me not to turn the car off. When I said I had a passenger at the dock, he nodded as if that answered more than it should. Another officer moved toward the building with a flashlight that cut clean white lines against the dark. Sutton asked how long I'd been there. 8 minutes, I said, then corrected myself. 9. They found the loading dock door unlatched from the inside. That struck me because every dock door in that place had been chained for years. The second officer called out that he had prints in the dust and a set of recent scuff marks where something heavy had been dragged. No one came down the ramp. No footsteps approached out of the dark. The building felt like a room where a conversation had just ended. Sutton unloaded questions and let me set them down at my own pace. He asked about the sedan. He asked about the man and whether he'd given a name. I told him what I knew, which wasn't much. He said he worked here, I offered. Said it like a person says their own address. We've had calls, Sutton said. Alarm pings in this block, then nothing when a unit arrives. It's been happening at the same time for a week. He looked at the clock on my dash, then at the dark building. You mind popping the back seat for me? I unlocked the rear door. On the bench seat, where the man had been a folded paper, had slid half under the floor mat. Sutton lifted it with 2 fingers. It was a time card stub from Midwest Cold Storage, dated 11 years earlier. The top edge torn, the name line blacked out with a marker pressed hard enough to leave grooves. Across the bottom in pencil, someone had written 3 numbers and a word. 247 North. Did he leave that? Sutton asked. I didn't see him write anything I said, and that was true. They searched the building for 40 minutes, while I idled at the edge of the lot, feeling like a man who'd been told to hold a door and then watched the hallway disappear. Eventually, another unit rolled up with a supervisor who took my statement again under the stronger light of his dash lamp. They never found my passenger. They found a pry bar left on the dock and a circle of footprints that started near the door and ended near the same door, as if someone had walked themselves into or out of a decision. No footprints crossed the lot toward the river. None came back to my car. Sutton handed my license through the window and said I was free to go. He added in a voice that attempted casual and didn't quite get there, that if the man contacted me again, I should call the number on his card first and the dispatcher second. I promised I would. On my way out, I glanced at the dock. The door had been lowered and chained again. The window, where the light had flickered, looked like every other window. The only difference was in my head, where the image kept repeating exactly as I had seen it. I dropped the next fare at a hotel near the highway and parked under a street light to collect myself. That was when I noticed the second folded paper tucked into the map flap on the back of the passenger seat. I hadn't seen him put it there. It was a photograph, the kind you get from a department badge printer curled at the edges from being carried too long. The image had been scratched with something sharp, almost erased, but the outline of a face remained, if you turned it sideways and let the light work at it slowly. On the back, in the same tight pencil, were 2 words, overtime claim. I took the photo to the station the next afternoon and handed it to Sutton, who looked at it like it was a memory he'd tried to forget. He said there had been a dispute when the plant closed. Some employees never got their last checks. A few had filed claims, then stopped showing to hearings. Records from that period were spotty, flooded out, or boxed wrong. We still get calls, he said, usually around tax time. I kept driving the night shift. Work is work. Marisol would sometimes see me pull in for coffee and ask if I had taken any rides to nowhere lately. We didn't joke about it, not really, but sometimes the corners of conversation turned that way without trying. Every so often, around 2:45, I would find myself near the river, whether I meant to be or not. I never turned into that lot again. The fence stayed crooked. The sign stayed rusted. If I happened to be at a red light at 2:47, I would feel the urge to glance at the rearview mirror, as if something at that exact minute might happen behind me instead of ahead. Last spring, I drove past the warehouse in daylight, and it looked smaller than I remembered, less like a landmark, and more like a building that had simply run out of time. The windows still blacked out the dock door, chained weeds growing through cracks that once saw 1,000 deliveries. A man in a hard hat stood near a surveyor's tripod, writing on a clipboard. He didn't look up when I slowed, and there was no reason he should have. I keep the pencil-scratched photo in the glove box, not because I think I'll need it, but because it sits there like a receipt nobody claimed. Once in a while, the heater whistle starts up without being hit, and for a second I hear the idol of that night working its way back through the vents. It isn't much. It's just enough. When the clock slides past 2:47 and nothing happens, I breathe easier, and then I remember that not everything you drive away from stays behind you. Sometimes it keeps pace in the mirror, not to catch you, just to make sure you know that it still can. I was only 10 years old when I learned that an airport could feel more dangerous than any street. It was the spring of 1999, and my older brother Matt had been trusted to shepherd me from New York to Florida to stay with our aunt for the summer. He was 15, then proud of the responsibility, and I remember the way he clutched our boarding passes like they were proof that he was grown. My parents couldn't come with us, so they walked us as far as security would allow and told us to call when we landed. Everything about it should have been exciting, but all I can remember now is how long the afternoon shadows stretched across the terminal floor and how every announcement on the loudspeaker sounded too loud, like a voice pressed too close to my ear. We reached the gate almost an hour early. Back then, you didn't have much in the way of security checks or digital boards that told you everything. It was just a counter. A few agents in navy jackets and a group of tired travelers slouched in molded plastic chairs. Matt bought me a Sprite from the vending machine and tried to act like that made up for his nerves. I noticed him looking around more than usual, tapping his sneaker against the carpet while pretending to read a sports magazine. That was when the man first appeared. He wore a gray suit that looked a size too small and carried a leather briefcase he never set down. His hair was slicked back in the style of someone older, but his face didn't match. He looked like he was 40 and 20 at the same time, sharp features that felt borrowed rather than his own. He glanced at us then at the flight display and then sat 2 seats away, without opening his case or shifting in his chair. When I caught his eyes, he smiled in a way that didn't reach the rest of his face. After a while, he leaned forward close enough for me to hear, but quiet enough that the others didn't notice. "Allison," he said, using my name with the ease of someone who'd known it for years. "Your aunt sent me to help you board. She thought you might be nervous." The way he said it made me freeze. Matt immediately straightened in his seat and looked at me like I had betrayed him just by listening. We hadn't told anyone my name, not even the gate agent yet. Matt said as firmly as he could manage, "We're fine. My parents already checked us in." The man smiled again, softer this time, and shrugged like he'd expected resistance. "Of course," he said. "Just thought you'd like someone to walk with you. Crowds can be scary." He adjusted his tie, but didn't move away. The minutes stretched heavy after that. Matt whispered to me not to talk, not to answer anything else, and I nodded, but it was too late. My name was already out in the open, hanging between us. The man didn't press further, but he didn't leave either. He sat there with his briefcase balanced perfectly on his knees, watching the windows as if something outside had his attention. When boarding was called, Matt grabbed my hand and pulled me into the line. We didn't look back, but I could feel the man behind us close enough that I imagined I could hear the faint tap of his shoes on the carpet. The agent scanned our tickets and told us to wait at the bottom of the jet bridge until families with small children were finished. That was when the man stepped forward again. He held out what looked like a laminated badge, flashed it quick, and said to the agent, "They're with me." Their aunt asked me to escort them. The agent hesitated, looking from him to us. My heart was beating so hard I thought it would lift me off the ground. Matt spoke louder than I'd ever heard him before. "No, he's not. He doesn't know us. Our parents are meeting us in Florida." His voice cracked on the last word, but it did the job. The agent frowned, turned back to the man, and asked for more ID. For a second it looked like he might argue, but then he gave a polite nod and stepped out of line, as though he'd simply changed his mind. We boarded and took our seats, both of us shaking too much to speak. I remember looking out the window, watching the ground crew move like tiny figures and catching sight of him again. He was standing just beyond the glass, his suit sharp against the late afternoon light, watching the plane as if he had every right to be there. It was only later, after we landed safely in Florida, that the story took on another layer. My aunt picked us up at the gate, smiling and relieved, and when we told her about the man, she grew pale. She called the airport that evening, and a day later a security officer phoned her back. They said there was no record of any escort registered for our flight. More than that, there was no employee with the badge number described and no man matching that description seen by any cameras near our gate. The only person who remembered him was the janitor named Jerome, who had been sweeping near the vending machines. He told the officer he'd seen the man sit down, open his briefcase just slightly, then close it without taking anything out. He said he thought it was odd, but not enough to bother reporting. Jerome admitted that when he turned back later, the man was gone, though he couldn't recall which way he had walked. For years afterward, whenever I found myself in an airport, I would catch glimpses of people who reminded me of him. Too neat, too watchful, too ready. With a name they shouldn't know. Most of the time I could shake it off, tell myself it was memory filling in blanks. But sometimes when the gate is crowded and the lights hum above, I feel that same presence just outside the corner of my eye. I still travel often for work, and I'm careful now. Careful not to trust a smile that arrives too quickly. Careful not to give my name, until I must careful not to let the hum of the terminal lull me into thinking every stranger is harmless. Because somewhere in those crowds, among the rolling bags and the tired announcements, there are people who wait for the right moment to pretend they already belong in your life. And if you let them even for a second, they will. The last real job I worked alone at night was a highway gas station that never completely slept, even when the valley felt emptied of people and sound. My shift ran from 10 to 6, long enough to learn the noises the building made when it settled, and the particular ways the wind used our canopy as an instrument. The fluorescents hummed with a thin, persistent note, and moths orbited the lights even when the air felt too cold for anything living to bother. We were a single-story box with a cooler wall, a coffee island that burned everything after midnight, and 4 pumps that clicked awake whenever a car rolled close enough to wake their sensors. The station sat alone on a flat stretch west of town, where Highway 285 turns darker, and the San Luis Valley runs wide, under a sky that seems wider still. Most nights were predictable in a way that makes the back of your mind relax, which can be its own kind of problem if you work alone. Truckers came through right after midnight, grabbed coffee and jerky, and left without speaking more than necessary. Ranch hands drifted in nearer to 4, their pickups ticking with heat as they cooled and their boots tapping sand from the floor mats. Between those waves, the building felt like a held breath. I counted bills, wiped counters that were already clean, and listened to the radio that Trooper Hayes suggested I keep on a low volume. The first time I noticed the man in the blue hoodie, it was the timestamp that held me rather than anything about his appearance. He pulled to pump 4 at exactly 3:17 a.m., stepped out with the hood up despite the calm air, and prepaid $12 in exact cash without looking at me longer than he needed. His car was a late model sedan with paint that might have been gray or blue, depending on how the canopy lights decided to argue about it. He never took a receipt, never asked for a restroom, never bought anything inside. He replaced the nozzle, stared at the digital total like it meant something beyond numbers, and turned north without accelerating hard. The next night, he returned at the same minute and did the same thing. $12 again, exact bills, counted into my palm with the precision of someone who practiced in a mirror. His hood stayed up, not in a way that suggested hiding more, in the way a person wears a routine that has become clothing. He never smelled like alcohol or weed, and his eyes, when I caught them briefly through the glass, had the clear, serious look of someone rehearsing a task rather than committing a crime. I started to test the station clock against my watch because it bothered me how exact the timing stayed. It wasn't 15 past or 20, after or a rounding from traffic lights that might hold a person. It was always 3:17, and the pump counter always stopped between $11.92 and exactly 12. Prepay meant he shouldn't be able to overrun the number, yet twice the display stuck at $11,098 until the last half second, then jumped to $1,200 like it had been waiting for permission. He never flinched when it did that, which somehow made the event feel less like a glitch and more like a detail I didn't understand. There isn't much to do at 3:10 in the morning, except look out the glass and build stories about the lives passing under your lights. By the 5th night, I stood where the cooler doors reflected the pumps so I could watch without looking like I was watching. He pulled in with the same turn signal tick, rolled to a stop, with the same short nod of the front end, and stepped out in that same calm manner that carries its own weather. $12 again, same pocket, same. Folded stack of ones, and a 5, edges squared by pressure. I told myself it was nothing more than someone counting miles and rationing money, which is reasonable enough on a road that keeps going long after you should have stopped driving. Still, the exactness changed how the air felt. I began setting my coffee at 3:16, and waiting without admitting that was what I was doing. When you work nights, you pretend you are not keeping track of anything except time and cash, but your body knows the patterns and leans toward them all the same. On the 7th night, I wrote the time on the back of the register tape just to prove something to myself. I wrote the amount and the pump number, and then I did it again the next night, thinking I might tire of my own attention if I made the habit formal. The small stack of tapes in the drawer felt heavier than paper has any right to feel. I kept the radio low as always, and the dispatcher's voice came and went like weather. "Four Corners dispatch to 1-7. She said more than once, and Hayes would answer in that steady, awake tone people use when fatigue has made them careful. I mentioned the pattern to him when he came in around 2 one morning. For coffee and a granola bar he never finished. He nodded without laughing, which I appreciated, and said he'd park across the frontage road the next night just to be visible. He warned me not to engage and not to step outside unless something required it. People have rituals, he said, and they don't like help with them. He said it gently, the way he offered warnings about deer near mile markers, as information rather than fear. The man still rolled in at 3:17, even with the trooper's unit angled under the mesquite across the road. If he noticed the cruiser, he didn't perform noticing it. He prepaid, fueled, and left. And a moment after his tail lights merged with the highway, Hayes pulled out behind him without lighting up. The radio stayed quiet 3 minutes, then carried back the unhelpful truth that the sedan turned onto a county road and drove within the limit until the trooper decided following would be more provocative than useful. No violations, Hayes said, and the dispatcher acknowledged with the neutral calm she used for both good and bad. By the 10th night, the pattern had done what patterns do when you watch them long enough. It began to feel like the strongest thing in the room. The station's noises weakened against it, and my attention narrowed until my other tasks felt like excuses to be near the window. It snowed lightly that night, the kind of dry crystals that can't decide whether to land or drift away again. The highway sounded different under that dusting, a quieter hiss that reached the pumps a second later than usual. 3:16 passed, and I told myself not to check my watch, then checked it anyway, the second hand pushing calmly toward the mark it always reached. 3:17 came and went with nothing under the canopy except light and air. A minute stretched and became longer, and the sensation that I had missed something important made the back of my neck go cold. The radio clicked once, then again, but carried no voice. I moved from the register to the end of the counter with my coffee in my hand, feeling ridiculous for making a ceremony of standing there. The lot stayed empty. The snow made faint lines where wind gathered it along the concrete seams. At 3:21, the sedan slipped in without its headlights on, then clicked them up almost immediately, like a person remembering how to act. He chose pump 2 instead of 4, and before I could decide what that meant, he stepped inside for the first time since I had noticed him, the bell over the door sounding louder than it ever had. His hood was up as always, and his hands were bare despite the cold. He put $12 on the counter and said very quietly, "12 on 4. "You're at 2, I answered, because the way the words landed made me not want to say anything except the fact in front of me. He stood still long enough that I thought he might turn and move the car, but he didn't. He was looking past me toward the cooler glass where the pumps reflected faint and doubled. "It used to be 4, he said, and that was all. I keyed the prepay for 2, and the register printed a receipt by its own habit. He didn't take it any more than he ever had. He nodded once and left, and the bell sounded again, and the canopy lights picked him up in the same color they always assigned him. What changed inside me wasn't dramatic, just a small shift, like a shelf settling under weight you didn't know it was carrying. I watched him fuel and replace the nozzle, and then instead of turning north as he had every other night, he idled long enough to fog the glass of his own rear window and turned south toward town. Hayes called over the radio a minute later, saying he was headed back my way, and I answered without thinking about whether answering was something clerks were supposed to do. Copy the dispatcher said, her voice making the word harmless and official at once. The trooper pulled in at 3:29, his unit ticking with heat as he stepped out and looked toward the highway like he might see what direction a decision traveled. I told him about the pump change and the quiet sentence the man had spoken without urgency. Hayes didn't ask me to repeat the words, which I was grateful for, because they already sounded strange in my mouth. He nodded slowly and looked at the register tape I slid across the counter, the small stack with the times and amounts. Each scribbled with my neat numbers I had learned to trust. We had a call earlier, he said finally, about a sedan parked north of town 2 nights in a row just off County 14. No disturbance, no driver seen. Might be nothing, might be a person sleeping off a shift. I knew better than to ask for more than that, and he knew better than to promise a conclusion. He left to check the county turnoff, and the radio filled the building with the soft exchanges that stand between urgent moments. Location codes nested with road names, and the dispatcher's patient questions asked at angles that never feel like pressure. I cleaned the coffee station and pretended the sound of the pump relays resetting didn't make me look up every single time. The man didn't return the next night or the night after or the week after that. Patterns are strong until they aren't, and then what you have left are the grooves your attention carved while the pattern lasted. I kept glancing at 3:17, even when the bell over the door rang for someone ordinary buying cigarettes, or a rancher with a paper bag of snacks for a day already begun. Hayes stopped in twice without coffee and stood by the window long enough for the silence to feel companionable. He never said the sedan had been found or that it hadn't, and I never asked directly, not because I didn't want to know, but because knowledge sometimes stirs something you would rather let settle. One small thing remained that no one else would have noticed. Our pump controller ran a line test at 3:30 to check for pressure drops, and it made a click-thud sound that was easy to ignore if you didn't already expect it. After the man stopped coming, I realized the test sometimes fired early, a quiet double click that landed exactly at 3:17 on my watch, even when no car sat under the canopy. The first time I heard it, I laughed at myself, then didn't laugh at all. The station had schedules that had nothing to do with him or me, of course, and the machine wasn't aware of our noticing, but the sound began to feel like a page turning in a book I couldn't stop reading. I left that job the following fall for work that let me see the sun more often. Though I still drive past some nights when I can't sleep and the valley looks like a flat sheet of dark cloth spread tight. The new clerk keeps the lights brighter and the coffee fresher, and sometimes I think that might be enough to keep a person from counting minutes too closely. When my phone reads 3:17, whether I am near that station or nowhere close, I still look up as if headlights will catch me. And the weak comfort is knowing that if nothing appears, the pumps will still make their small mechanical remark to the air. They aren't speaking to anyone, not really, but the sound knows where to land. I don't usually think much about the nights I spent on the road, though a few of them have a way of staying sharper in my memory than the rest. Back in 2015, I was crisscrossing California for work, staying in whatever mid-range motel looked safe enough, and had a vacancy when my shift ended. That spring, I pulled into a little two-story place just outside Sonora, the kind with faded plastic signage and a pool that hadn't been filled in years. The sun was sliding behind the foothills when I checked in, and I remember the clerk, Tony. His tag said, moving slowly through the motions like someone who'd been repeating the same script for too long. The motel had that quiet lived-in smell that older places carry, where the carpets hold on to decades of air conditioning and cleaner. The walls were thin enough to hear a neighbor's television through, but not quite well enough to make out the words. I was on the second floor near the corner, and there was only one other door on my side, with its curtains drawn tight and a yellow glow behind them. That was room 209. I noticed her the first time as I passed by with my duffel. The woman in 209 had the door cracked open just a few inches, not enough to see inside, but enough for her to look out. She was pale in the light from her television with dark hair pulled back in a knot. She didn't speak, didn't nod, didn't even move when I glanced over, just let her eyes follow me, the way you might track something passing by a window. I tried to give her a polite half-smile, the kind of acknowledgement strangers trade in motels without meaning much by it. She didn't return it. That night, after I showered and set my laptop on the desk, I heard a faint sound through the wall that separated our rooms. At first, I thought it was a recording soft murmurs, like a conversation played on low volume, but it never had the pauses or rise and fall you'd expect from normal speech. It was steadier, almost like someone pacing while repeating the same words over and over. Every so often there was a knock, 3 taps spaced evenly against what sounded like the dresser or the headboard. It wasn't loud enough to file a complaint over, but it was the kind of noise you couldn't unhear once you noticed it. In the morning, Tony asked at the desk if everything was all right with my room. I told him yes, then mentioned lightly that my neighbor seemed to keep odd hours. He looked up quick when I said it, then covered it with a shrug. "Place gets all kinds," he muttered, sliding my receipt across the counter. I could tell by the way his eyes moved that he knew more than he wanted to say. The second night, the routine was the same. Around 2 in the morning, the murmurs started up again, low and steady, through the wall. When I pressed my ear closer, I realized I couldn't make out any actual words, just the cadence of speech without content, like listening through static. Then came the 3 knocks, always the same. Rhythm followed by silence for several minutes before it all repeated. I tried to drown it out with television until I drifted off, but I woke later to the sound of her door latch clicking. When I peeked through my blinds, I saw her stepping outside barefoot, standing perfectly still under the neon glow of the vacancy sign, staring at the empty highway like she was waiting for a car that never came. By the 3rd night, it had shifted from strange to unsettling. When I returned to my room late, the door to 209 was ajar again, the same way it had been that first evening. This time, though, the woman's face was closer to the gap, her eyes catching mine, before I even reached my door. I muttered a quiet good evening, but she didn't respond. Instead, she slowly pushed the door closed until only the click of the latch remained. That night, the murmuring grew louder, and the knocks became irregular sometimes. On the dresser, sometimes, on the wall we shared. Around 3, I thought I heard her whisper directly outside my door, but when I checked the peephole, The walkway was empty. The next morning, I'd had enough. I asked Tony at the desk who was staying in 209. His jaw tightened and he said, "Nobody's checked into that room this week." I reminded him I'd seen her with my own eyes, but he shook his head like it wasn't a matter worth pressing. "We keep that one locked. Pipes are bad. Don't worry about it." He handed me a new key card for a room on the opposite side of the building. I moved my things that afternoon, but curiosity got the better of me before I left. I walked past 209 and tried the knob. It turned easily, and the door opened to a room that looked untouched for months. Bed sheets pulled tight, no luggage, no signs of anyone staying there. The air smelled faintly of dust and something sour beneath it. On the nightstand was a pad of motel stationery, with 3 dark indentations pressed into the paper as though someone had knocked against it with their knuckles hard enough to leave a trace. I didn't stay another night. I drove into town and found a chain hotel instead, even if it cost twice as much. A few days later, when my work brought me back through Sonora, I stopped at a diner near the highway. One of the sheriff's deputies was eating at the counter, and I asked him offhand if he knew anything about the old motel. He looked at me, then at his coffee, and said, "Only room 209, right? We've had calls about her before." He didn't explain who her was, and I didn't ask because the way he left it hanging told me I didn't want to know. It's been years since then, and most of my road trips blur together now, but sometimes in quiet hotels, I still find myself listening for those soft, meaningless murmurs through the walls. I never checked the pad of paper I took from that nightstand, but I know it's still folded in the bottom of my glove box, the faint grooves of 3 knocks pressed deep enough to outlast memory. I had just finished my freshman year when I moved into an off-campus apartment that was a little too cheap for the neighborhood. It was one of those squat, brick-faced complexes built in the 70s, the kind that smelled faintly of dust and boiled vegetables in the stairwells. Most of the tenants were older people who kept to themselves and looked away politely when you passed them at the mailboxes. It wasn't a bad place for the price, but there was something about the first floor that always felt heavier than the rest of the building, like the air settled lower and stayed stale longer. My unit was on the 2nd floor, but directly below me was Unit 1A. It had no name on the buzzer, no mail in its slot, and the blinds stayed drawn tight at all hours. The first few weeks, I assumed it was vacant. Then one night in early September, I came home from the campus lab at nearly 2 in the morning and noticed the faintest glow seeping out between the blinds. It wasn't a warm lamplight glow, but the blue-white of a television flickering in uneven rhythms. That was the first sign the place wasn't empty after all. Not long after I started hearing noises from that unit. At first, it was the shuffle of movement, a dragging step across the tile, and then something stranger, the sound of the door opening in the middle of the night, followed by hushed voices that never seemed to climb above a whisper. They would linger just outside in the hall, speaking in a tone that suggested more listening than talking, before the door closed again with a soft click. I tried to brush it off as late-night guests or maybe a friend crashing there, but the hours became more unusual and the visits grew longer. One night, I decided to peek through my own peephole when I heard them. The hallway lights in that building were dim and yellow, always buzzing with a faint electrical hum. At 2:45 in the morning, I saw a man standing perfectly still outside 1A. his head tilted slightly toward the door as though he was listening for a signal. He didn't knock. He didn't shift his weight. He stood there for nearly 10 minutes before the door opened just enough for him to slip inside without a word. The weeks that followed carried a quiet unease. Packages were left at the front desk addressed only to occupant. I once saw a padded envelope with no return address. The super placed it on the shelf with the rest of our parcels, but when I came down less than an hour later, it was gone. Nobody saw who picked it up. Another time, walking back from class in the early evening, I noticed a police cruiser idling at the far end of the street, the officer watching the building with his window rolled halfway down. He didn't approach, didn't get out, just sat there until dusk gave way to night, then drove off without explanation. What unsettled me most were the patterns. Every visit to 1A seemed to happen at the same window of time, always between 2 and 3 in the morning. Always the same silence and the same quick entry. I tried asking the building manager once, but he waved it away with a muttered "rents paid, that's what matters." It left me with the impression he preferred not to know more. The strangest night came in late October. I had fallen asleep with my desk lamp on, buried in a programming assignment. I woke to the sound of 3 quiet knocks, steady and deliberate, on my own apartment door. My heart pounded so loud I thought I'd imagined it. When I got up and checked the peephole, the hallway was empty, but down below, faint and clear, I heard the creak of 1A's door opening. The timing felt too exact to be coincidence, as though whoever knocked on my door had gone straight down to that unit afterward. By then, curiosity was tangled with fear, and I began to keep a notebook by my bed. I wrote down the times I heard footsteps, the nights the television glow flickered through those blinds, the patterns of visitors. When I mentioned it to a detective I knew through a campus safety program, Officer Lyman, his face hardened in a way that made me regret saying anything. He told me quietly, "Stay out of it. Just stay out." He never explained further. The following week, 1A went silent. No visitors, no flickering glow, no dragging footsteps across tile. The blinds stayed shut, but I never heard movement again. Eventually, the slot on the mailboxes was filled with a new name written in marker. Like the apartment had been reassigned without notice. The new tenant was a graduate student, quiet and polite, who looked confused when I asked if he'd noticed anything unusual about the place. To this day, I don't know who lived in 1A before or what business passed through that door in the middle of the night. All I have are the pages of my old notebook lines of times and dates that don't mean much to anyone else. Sometimes when I look at those notes, I wonder if I was tracking them, or if in some way they were tracking me back. That was the last one I'll share tonight. Telling these stories always leaves me with a certain quiet unease, not from the moments themselves, but from how they linger long after the places are gone. None of them were extraordinary in their own right. Motels, diners, apartments, roadsides, ordinary settings where people pass through without notice. Yet it's in those places that the smallest things unsettle you most. A figure in the wrong place, a sound that doesn't belong, a silence that lasts longer than it should. Looking back on all of them, I'm not sure the fear comes from what happened, but from what never fully resolved. The half-open door that closed too softly, the voice that carried no words, the person who seemed to know you before you knew them. These details sink deeper into memory than the clean facts of any day. Maybe that's why they return so easily when the lights are low and the world outside your window feels heavier than it should. If you've stayed with me this long, perhaps it's because you recognize some part of these stories in your own life. The moments you couldn't explain, the nights you didn't speak of later, the memories that pressed themselves into your mind and refused to leave. Those are the ones that define us quietly, even years later. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. It means something to know these stories can be shared and remembered in the stillness of the night. If you'd like to hear more, feel free to subscribe. Share this with someone who might understand and keep me company for future nights. And tell me, have you ever lived somewhere that carried its own secrets, the kind you could only sense late at night?